weak people are a problem in general. And I don't mean physically weak. I mean cowardly, let's say, and deceitful, because I'm thinking it more in terms of moral weakness. Well, there's a variety of reasons. First of all, if you can't support your own weight, let's say, then someone else has to do it. And that's not good. And then if you don't make your pathway, if you don't pick a forthright and useful and noble pathway through life, then you'll become bitter and too hurt by the tragedy of existence. And then you tend to seek your revenge wherever you can get it. And that's not good. So it's a mistake on all fronts. It's not good for you. It's not good for your family. It's not good for the community. It's certainly not a good medium to long-term strategy, because life is very, very difficult and you have to be prepared for that. And Oslo, and he wrote me a letter. He was a 17-year-old boy. And he said that my work had been very helpful to him. His father had died suddenly about 6 months before. And he found his dad when he was dying and was very, very shocked and horrified and hurt by what had happened. And I had recommended on my YouTube lectures that one thing you could aim for was to be the strongest person at your father's funeral. And so that's what he did. And he helped his mom, and he wrote a 200-word eulogy and got through it. And so good for him. That's strength and necessary. It's a terrible thing that happened, but he did everything he could not to make it any worse than it had to be.
But do you never see that showing weakness can be a strength too?
Not weakness, vulnerability. That's a whole different thing. To admit to the fact that you're vulnerable, that's a form of courage. That's not a form of weakness. But that leads you to take whatever steps are necessary to deal with that properly. It isn't some facade that you're invulnerable. No one is invulnerable by any stretch of the imagination.
All of the people that I know who have become successful in any way use a structured means to organize their time. They have lists of things to do, like every day there's a list of things to do that day. Every week there's a list of things to do that week. Every month there's a list of things to do that month. At every level of temporal resolution, there's a sequence of plans, and those plans are implemented on a day-to-day basis. You cannot be, and successful isn't the right way of thinking about it, because I'm not thinking about, I'm not really thinking about rising up the corporate ladder. You know what I mean? And that's sort of what success has come to be in our culture. That isn't what I mean. You can't have a life that you're going to find acceptable without that, because you need the vision and the plans to give you purpose and direction. That's where all your positive emotion comes from. All your motivation is laying out plans that are worth attaining and then observing yourself moving towards them. That's the source of most positive meaning. And then also, without that structure, you're so lost that you're going to be anxious and overwhelmed. It's really like being in a foreign country, like isolated and alone with no map. I don't know where the hell I am. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. The rains are going to come, the storms are going to come, and maybe it's winter, and I don't know where I am or where I'm going.
We actually have a biological instinct for meaning that orients us in the world. And that instinct manifests itself when we place ourselves in a position in the world where we're competent, where what we're doing is working, so that we're not too terrified and anxious, but also while we're simultaneously advancing ourselves and improving our ability to cope with the world. So for example, if you watch an athlete, a high-level athlete, who's at the peak of his or her performance, you see someone who's extraordinarily practiced at what they're doing and has developed the expertise necessary to do it. But then you also see them push themselves on that developmental edge to make themselves just that much better. And that function is associated with an intrinsic sense of meaning. And whenever you see anyone manifest that, you are automatically drawn to it. You see that when an actor pushes him or herself beyond their limits. You see that when someone speaks extemporaneously and manages it extraordinarily well. And I'm trying to help people understand that this meaning is a true phenomenon. It's not a secondary thing. And also to point out that most of the time, that meaning is associated with the adoption of responsibility. Make friends with people who want the best for you. And that's a meditation on my own childhood and adolescence to some degree. I had friends who wanted the best for me and friends who didn't. And, they were friends who, some of them were aiming up and some of them were aiming down. And if you have a friend that's aiming down and you do something that's aiming up, then they're generally not that happy about it. They try to top your accomplishment with one of their own, hypothetical or real, or put down what you're doing, or offer you a cigarette if you're trying to quit and you've kind of done that successfully, or a drink if you've been drinking too much and are just trying to stop being an alcoholic, or they're cynical and bitter and devoted towards no good. And sometimes that's family members too. And sometimes it's even part of you, But this chapter is a injunction to people, is like you have an ethical responsibility to take care of yourself, you have an ethical responsibility to surround yourself with people who have the courage and faith and wisdom to wish you well when you've done something good and to stop you when you're doing something destructive. And if your friends aren't like that, then they're not your friends. And maintaining your friendships with them might not even be in their interest. And so it's a tricky argument to make, because I'm not saying, whenever anyone's in trouble, you should, push them into a ditch and then give them a couple of kicks. That's not the idea. The idea is that, I had a couple of rules I didn't write about. One was be careful about whom you share good news with. And another was be careful about whom you share bad news with. And those rules ring in people's minds quite quickly. A friend is someone you can share good news with, You go to them and you say, hey, look, this good thing happened to me. And they say, look, I'm so happy that happened to you. Like, way to be. And they don't think, God damn it, why didn't that happen to me? And you didn't deserve it. Here's a bunch of reasons you're stupid and why it won't work. It's like, that's not helpful. And so I would say, if people are, the other thing people are doing, if they're trying to drag you down, let's say, is they're trying to see if you'll put up with it. Because they have this idea that maybe life isn't worth living and things aren't good. And that if they can besmirch, let's say, to use an archaic term, something that's pristine and good, then they demonstrate to themselves that there is no true ideal and that there's no necessary reason to be responsible and to strive forward. And so they use you as a test case. I'll just push you down into the low lobster bin and see how you respond. And if you put up with it, then yeah, my cynicism is fully justified. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. That's what I'm writing about now. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty. And that's unbelievably useful, because while beauty calls people to their higher being, I would say, and to make friends with beauty is to introduce yourself very carefully to one of the mysteries of life that make it worth living. The first proposition, that life is suffering and that we make it worse with our malevolence. I think everyone understands that to be true. But the second is that the best way to confront that is to shoulder responsibility voluntarily and to live in truth. I think those are even more powerful ideas, because you could say that the cure for a malaise or the treatment for a disease is more powerful than the malaise or the disease itself. And if responsibility and truth are antidotes to suffering and malevolence, then that means that they have a power that's transcendent over suffering and malevolence.
You should use a calendar to structure your days, because if you know what you're doing tomorrow, it decreases your anxiety substantially, because you need that kind of structure. You need a pathway. You need to have a map, and you need to know where you're located on the map, and you need to know how you're moving forward. And that gives you hope, because you're moving towards goals that you regard as worthwhile. And it stops you from being anxious, because you're not entirely directionless and lost. And so learning how to manage your time is useful. And you can start with a calendar. You can start with simple things, like you could put in, when you're likely to go to bed and when you're likely to get up. And regulating that's useful. That should be relatively ritualistically consistent.